Hello, folks, and welcome to another edition of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. I'm Mark. This is July 16th of 2013. Very early in the morning here, about 5:30 a.m. Today I'm going to be discussing something related to exopolitics, not exactly in the same way as I've approached the subject before, more of a different type of critique. For the most part, I will be focusing on something that was developed by Stephen Greer, M.D., who is has a medical degree, obviously, worked as an emergency room physician, has since left that line of work, as far as I know, and is now devoted full-time to various issues, including supposed disclosure of the existence of extraterrestrials, supposed free energy, which has supposedly been reverse engineered from extraterrestrial spacecraft, and various other issues. My views of Dr. Greer are very critical. They're not personal. I have nothing against him as an individual. I don't know him. Never met him face to face. Interestingly, he does belong to the same religion as I do, the Baha'i faith, and yet there is almost nothing that I've ever heard him say that I have agreed with maybe one or two minor exceptions. So I guess that shows the power of unity and diversity, which is a very important concept in the Baha'i faith, that you can have people with extraordinarily different ideas who are both nonetheless united through the power of the promised one of all ages, Baha'u'llah. But back to the subject. One of Dr. Stephen Greer's activities is connected with what I refer to as intentional contact, where people basically go into either a certain meditative state of mind, or go to a particular geographic location and attempt to make direct contact with extraterrestrial beings. That is something which Dr. Greer does through a group, perhaps organization, that he operates, which is referred to as CSETI, which is the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, not related to other groups which also have SETI in their names, including ESETI and two other groups which are simply referred to as SETI. Dr. Greer also runs something called ET Contact Now, which appears to be somewhat of an offshoot of CSETI, which basically are programs where Greer will take people to various locations. I think in particular the Mount Shasta area of California, and they will practice the exercises which Greer teaches them. What I am going to do here now is to attempt to, I guess the best word is deconstruct what these protocols are. Now, I cannot claim complete credit for this. Some of my ideas came as a result of a dialogue I was having with an individual whose name I don't know on a message board. I asked him, I said, if you would like me to use your name, I will. He did not respond, so I'm just saying that there's a portion of what I'm going to say which was suggested by him. I went and looked into it, and I ended up agreeing with him. He also has a very critical view of Dr. Stephen Greer. Now, a bit of the background of Dr. Greer. In addition to being a member of the Baha'i Faith, Greer is also a former teacher of transcendental meditation. TM is a technique which was developed, or perhaps transplanted, I suppose, from India by a fellow who is well known to people of my generation, named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, now deceased. He claimed that this technique of transcendental meditation, or TM, was a Vedic technique of meditation. The precise technique, although technically secret in a sense, meaning that it is only something that a person can learn by going and being taught directly by a TM teacher, is in fact not secret at all. It's been widely published on the web, and some of it has actually come out in court testimony where certain TM officials were required by the court to divulge the actual meditation technique. Also, certain TM teachers, presumably those who have left, have also revealed the mantras and the way in which the mantras are assigned, which is based on a combination of the age and gender of the person who was being initiated. So, in any event, that is Greer's background. It is a kind of passive meditation where a person goes into a very relaxed, mellow, forceless state. Person kind of drifts, I suppose, repeats the mantra in the back of their minds, does not try to focus on it, just repeats the word. If the mantra starts fading or a person's mind begins wandering, a person will quietly attempt to bring the mantra back into the center of their attention. Now, after TM had been around for a while, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi introduced certain so-called advanced techniques of meditation. One of those techniques is referred to as yogic flying, which is actually something very similar to Kundalini, where people will go into a very emotional state and start shaking. Very similar to what is often observed in many Pentecostal services, where people begin so-called being slain in the spirit, where they will actually go into what looks like an epileptic fit, fall down on the ground, begin shaking. Those kinds of reactions, very common reactions to extreme emotional excitation. So that is basically what people do, as I understand it. In this yogic flying thing, they lay down and they just periodically will hop up and down off the ground. They're not literally flying, at least not in the way that term is generally used. So that's basically one of the Vedic techniques. There are others which also involve repeating various mantras. Essentially, they are simply extensions of the original mantra the person was given. Person will also recite various scriptural texts from the Vedas, and so there are a number of different supposedly advanced techniques that are taught within TM. So the fact that Greer refers to his meditation technique, which he uses in supposedly contacting extraterrestrials, is not unusual in that sense. It is he's basically adopting a term from his own background as a TM teacher. Now, let's go on and talk more specifically about what I think is the real source of Greer's technique. Now, although in a sense you can say that TM is one of the sources, it is not the real source, and here's why. This kind of forceless or effortless meditation, which is practiced by people doing TM, is not at all what Greer is having his followers or devotees, or whatever term he would prefer, use. In other words, they are not getting into this kind of passive state and repeating a word in the back of their minds and just waiting to see what happens. The meditative technique which Greer teaches is actually a very active meditation, not a passive meditation. There is a deliberate or intentional attempt to make contact with extraterrestrial beings. Greer connects this technique of meditation or contact with remote viewing. For those of you unfamiliar with that term, it is a concept which was developed in certain secret projects of the U.S. military during the Cold War as a way of trying to psychically remote view what was happening in the former Soviet Union. The assumption was that the Soviets were doing it too, and so if the United States was going to keep up, well, we needed to have our own psychic warriors. And so they began this very elaborate program of training certain people in this kind of systematic clairvoyance, or clairvoyance literally clear seeing, where people will go into a kind of trance-like state and then attempt to view something remotely, either physically or in time, something in the past, something in the future, or something in another physical location. Now, here's a brief excerpt from something that Greer wrote, in which he describes how he does his meditative technique. I'll just read 3 sentences from it. I went into a state of unbounded consciousness, and then expanded awareness off the mountain, around the Alps, into space, and out into our solar system. Seeing the vastness of space, I said to these craft and the ETs on board, "My name is Steve. I don't know if you remember me, but we met a couple years ago." Now bear in mind, that is a meditative activity. What Greer does is he will take people on these excursions where that's what he has people do, among other things, using lasers supposedly to make contact with these beings. He'll supposedly photograph these entities as well. Various techniques that he uses. Now, here's another brief excerpt from a talk from an interview he did on the show Project Camelot, which was hosted by Kerry Cassidy and Bill Ryan. This is a Creative Commons interview. Greer said, "One of the sets of evidence we have through CSETI, which has gone around the world and made contact all over the world with thousands of people. We have never had a harmful event happen. We have never had anything resembling anything that has frightened or harmed anyone on the contact team. I think that what I'm saying is one has to be very careful if you're going to be involved with disclosure and contact in saying, this group is bad, that group is good. By group, he's referring to different extraterrestrial species. Now, Greer, therefore, only mimics the advanced TM technique program, also called the TM City program, in name only, although he refers to what he is doing is developing cities, city which is a Sanskrit word for power or ability or accomplishment. Really, the cities that he is talking about are entirely different from those which are developed in the TM City program. So, where do these cities that Greer has discussed actually come from? And here, I think, is the source. It's not TM. Back in 1953, George Adamski wrote a book with Desmond Leslie called Flying Saucers Have Landed. It's public domain. It was never copyrighted. I will go ahead and read for you an excerpt from this book and then talk about how similar that is to what Greer, in fact, is discussing as well. This is George Adamski speaking, I am a firm believer that people who desire to convey messages to one another can do so, even though they neither speak nor understand the other's language. This can be done through feelings, signs, and above all by telepathy. I have been teaching this as fact for 30 years, and now I concluded I would have to use this method if information of any kind was to pass between us, and there were lots of things I wanted to know, if I could only think of them. So, to convey the meaning of my first question to him meaning a man from Venus, I began forming, to the best of my ability, a picture of his planet in my mind. At the same time, I pointed to the sun, high in the sky. He understood this, and his expression so indicated. Then I circled the sun with my finger, indicating the orbit of the planet closest to the sun, and said, Mercury. I circled it again for the second orbit, and said, Venus. The third circle I spoke, Earth, and indicated the earth upon which we were standing. I repeated this procedure a second time, all the while keeping a clear picture of a planet in my mind as I was able to perceive, and this time pointing to myself as belonging to the earth. Then I indicated him with a question in my eyes and my mind. Now he understood perfectly. And, smiling broadly, he pointed to the sun, made one orbit, made the second, then, touching himself with his left hand, he gestured several times with his right index finger toward the second orbit. I took this to mean that the second planet was his home. So I asked, You mean you come from Venus? This was the third time I had spoken the word Venus in relation to the second planet, and he nodded his head in the affirmative. Then he too spoke the word Venus. His voice was slightly higher pitched than an adult man's. Its tonal quality was more that of a young man before his voice completes the change from childhood to maturity. And although he had spoken but one word, there was music in his voice, and I wanted to hear more of it. Okay, so that is a description of the technique that is used or was used by George Adamski. Now, for comparison, here is how Greer describes how he practices his technique. This is just a brief excerpt from a YouTube video which I transcribed. We train people in a meditation technique. It is Vedic. To be able to go into a deep level of the unbounded mind. From there, we teach them a Vedic approach from the Sanskrit to view distant places. Once there is a lock-on and seeing the extraterrestrial vehicle, then we turn it into what we call a coherent thought sequencing, where we then connect to their people or their communication system. And then we use our own coherent thought sequencing, like a laser, to show them our exact location. When you have a group of people doing this, we have never done it where we have not had contact in some form. And that's the first part. That's the primary part, because interstellar civilizations use technologies that interface with consciousness and thought. Always. So, I think that perhaps you can see the similarity. Although he refers to it as Vedic, to the best of my knowledge, there is no Vedic technique like this. Also, there is no resemblance with this technique and any technique that I am aware of, which has been taught by the Transcendental Meditation movement. Instead, it does appear as though he got the basic idea from George Adamski. So that's basically all I wanted to discuss. Hopefully that was interesting. Until next time, this is Dr. Mark Foster. Have a good one.